آزادی بیان.
言论自由。
free speech.
The first of the four norms is one that we all know under one label or another. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Avoid false speech. Most importantly, we should avoid outright lies. Here's the Buddha describing a person who breaks this norm. When he's been called to a town meeting, a group meeting, a gathering of his relatives, his guild, or the court, if he's asked as a witness, "Come and tell me, good man, what do you know?" If he doesn't know, he says, "Oh, I know." If he does know, he says, "I don't know." If he hasn't seen, he says, "Oh, I've seen." And if he has seen, he says, "No, I haven't seen that." Thus, he consciously lies for his own sake, for the sake of another, or for the sake of a certain reward. Now, that little sketch suggests that there are two features of the admonition against right speech. One of them, and this is extremely important in Buddhist thought, is that it is intention dependent. Richard Gombrich has very convincingly argued in a lot of his work that this is one of the very original things that the Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, brings into Indian thought. An emphasis on the intentionality, not just the ritual character of actions that we see in Vedic and other religions. I'm just appealing to his authority here. So the sketch suggests what's wrong, and what's wrong lies in part with intentionally misleading people, so that's a feature of it, about the truth as one sees it. So false speech bears on assertoric speech, claims about the way the world is or isn't. And maybe that's because in the example I just read you, and that's epitomized on the screen, we're dealing with someone who, remember, was called to be a witness. You might say, well, maybe these are special features of witnesses. They are to absorb this norm. Maybe it doesn't apply more generally. But I don't think that's true, and in any case, I don't think other texts support that narrow view, that it's only lying that the false speech norm prohibits. As everyone knows, if the wrong of lies is in the misleading, if that's what's wrong with it, then one can do that without stating any falsehood at all. It can mislead you, saying nothing false. Grice is filled with wonderful examples of this. Do you have any children? Asked of someone who has 6. Yes, I have a girl. It's not false in the case. Profoundly misleading and probably wrong, and wrong for the same reason. If what's wrong about misleading is that it manipulates others solely as a means to one's own end, or treats them without the respect that we owe them as people capable of conceiving their own ends, then surely it can also be wrong to mislead by recklessness or even negligence, at least when one knows or should know that others depend on one's word. So I'm going to follow a minority tradition within the suttas and say that the first principle of right speech requires us to avoid not only lies, that's the majority tradition, but also manipulative falsehoods of other kinds too. Of the 4 principles, false speech, abusive, divisive, and idle speech, this is the only one whose force is not doubted, and the only one that has received exhausting scrutiny in the Western philosophic tradition. We do, however, disagree about its basis and stringency. For Kant, some of whose ideas I echoed a few minutes ago, for Kant, the wrong of lying, anyway, is absolute. By the way, those of you who don't know Kant's general philosophy, the notion of an absolute wrong for Kant is just a pleonasm. It's not absolutely wrong, it's not wrong. Kant thinks we should never lie, under any circumstances, for any purposes, not even to prevent the murderer from finding his intended victim. Worse, Kant also thinks that those who do lie become morally responsible for all and any of the consequences of that lie, however unforeseeable. Even the murderer to whom you revealed Anne Frank hiding in her attic. All your fault. Now, few have found this convincing. By the way, few Kantians find this convincing. And even loyal Kantians twist and turn to show that either Kant doesn't mean this, or it doesn't follow from his premises, or read in light of the doctrine of virtue, there are escape hatches, and on and on and on. Anything to prevent Kant from saying what he so plainly and repeatedly says. Lying is always and absolutely wrong. Now, like lots of philosophers, I'm troubled by Kant, but not by his rigorism, not by this fact, this absurdly demanding view about speech. Because the Buddha's injunction is pretty rigoristic too. I'm troubled by Kant's formalism. A norm that is even plausibly absolute in force will have to be formulated under a very tight description, one that excludes from the definition of lying or misleading all the sorts of harmful falsehood that are not absolutely prohibited. Now, this is how the game works. Those of you who are lawyers will know precisely how to do this. And so we may have to say that a lie isn't a lie if its recipient has no right to be told the truth. That will fix the murderer at the door. Or it isn't a lie if we had good reason to make a mental reservation as to its truth. Roman Catholic moral theology depends on this claim. Certainly did in the days that we were burning bishops outside the door of Balliol College. This is morality as a tax lawyer thinks of it. Rules that are to be respected, qua rules, but only under some description, one description, that squeaks within the letter of the law, just barely under some conceivable interpretation of those words. Well, you can tell by my tone of voice that I don't find that convincing either as a form of argument or as a general moral outlook. I'm with Bernard Williams on lying, and I think that the basic wrong in lying consists in the way that it tends, when pervasive, to undermine trust. We need to cooperate, and we can't reliably do that without a reliable respect for accuracy, knowing the true from the false, and also what Williams calls sincerity, telling the truth as we see it. And we need to value these intrinsically, and not just instrumentally, if they are to get the bite that they need to have. Our common need to be able to take as true most of what other people tell us is, in most ordinary circumstances, embedded even in the very idea of communicative language. Paul Grice, I've mentioned him once, we're going to hear a bit about Grice in this lecture. Paul Grice argues that if we are to have a conversation at all, about anything, a belligerent conversation, the most elementary condition of fulfilling Mill's idea that we have a duty to speak, we have to rely on certain shared cooperative norms that make communication possible. Donald Davidson argues that unless we can make the charitable association that most others see most of the truths as we do and speak it, we will lack an adequate beachhead to interpret their language at all. Famous principle of charity. For all its utility in disputing and contending all the things that Mill rightly points to in Chapter 2, the ultimate foundations of our language, at least as a communicative device, and thus in some respects of our thought, are cooperative, and they depend on avoiding false speech. Now, although this shows why the norm is so fundamental to our well-being, it does not show how exigent it is. The odd lie does not undermine the basis of trust. We can speak intelligibly, though we know that the cooperative norms of speech are sometimes in breach. The principle of charity exerts holistic, overall influence in our language, not a one-by-one guarantee of truth or presumption of truth for every utterance. And we're not going to get an absolute or even near absolute duty to avoid falsehood on any of those bases. And I've already shown my hand in suggesting that Kant's argument won't give it to us either. I think the fact of the matter is simply this, that our loyalty to the truth, the primary norm of right speech, though extremely important, is not absolutely and indefeasibly important. And despite the occasional absolutist text, the Buddhist tradition mostly shares this view. Richard Gombrich points out that in the Vinaya, in the monastic code of discipline, lying is disapproved of, but actually not all that stringently among the monks, with the one absolutely charming exception of a monk's absolute duty not to falsely to pretend to have a deeper insight into the nature of reality than any other one. Horrifying to think what that would do to the business of philosophy.